G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. So, with a few things that came up this week, some interesting discussion points occurred, including references to plastic heresy and such. I've delayed putting out a different heresy video, in order to put out this one as my heresy video for the week. So, what is this video about? Well, this video is about the 3 polls that took place, as well as one little extra at the end, that I ran over YouTube and on Facebook. So I'll show you the YouTube results, but as you can probably imagine, the Facebook response is very, very similar. So, for each one of these polls that I put up, I want to show you the inciting thing that made me think of putting up the poll. Because I like to listen to the community and see what they've got to say, and hear their responses and see, how close to the money am I, how far am I, and what some of the comments and responses are, and gauge it a little bit. So for me, the first thing was this image. This is obviously one of the leaks of the plastic kits. And as you can see, in sort of the starting to blur out background, the Cataphractii Terminators are sitting roughly at the same level as the plastic Marines. And the Marines are clearly the same size, if not a smidge taller than the plastic Terminators. Now, these new plastic kits appear to me to be in a new scale. Very much that Chaos Space Marine larger scale that we're seeing in 40k. Not quite Primaris, but definitely that larger scale to try and true scale the Marines. On top of that, we see miniatures like Malagurst here, who, even though he's a crippled, hunched over Marine, who's doubled over in agony, he is still the height of a Cataphractii Terminator, if not slightly more, and next to the current consul of the Sons of Horus, is significantly taller. So, these things got me thinking. So I put out the poll. What do people prefer? Now, don't worry about what I vote in the poll. In this instance, I prefer the older scale. But I want to know what other people thought, and this was out of 3.1 thousand votes. So I think that's a reasonable sampling for people. And Primaris scale won out. Now, don't be fooled by data on the surface, because you have to read the comments to see what people are saying. And what I noticed in the comments was several things. First of which being, people prefer the slightly larger scale as the biggest thing for them. Is that Marines look more imposing next to other infantry. That was the most commonly repeated thing. People said it in different ways, but that was definitely the intent of it. Usually that they don't want their Marines feeling the size of Guardsmen. The second most common point they referred to was they didn't like that Marines looked a bit too stumpy. Now for me, I prefer the stumpy looking Marine because armour is bulky and armour should look stumpy. It makes you wider, not taller. Okay, that's my personal preference, but it was interesting to see what people said. So those are the definite 2 things. Third thing was people felt that the detail was easier to paint. Now, I've very much ummed and ahed on that one because I've actually measured Primaris models, measured the new Chaos Space Marines, and measured the old models, and the size difference on certain details is non-existent. In fact, it often is the exact same size, and the plate that the detail is sculpted onto simply got bigger. Things like the shoulder pads are identical size, helmets identical size, weapons often identical size to what they already were. So the Marine got bigger, but they usually got bigger in areas that didn't really affect the painting of the models, such as the waist or the thighs on the Marine. So interesting points there. But the big one that sort of counters all of these points was that many people said the exact same thing I did, which is, if you're going to upscale Marines, you need to look at the range around them. So scaling up existing product lines, such as the Legion specialist units for Horus Heresy. So are you going to go and remake all those Legion special units? People go, well, it's not that many. Isn't it now? Let's ignore, I don't think it's fair to, but let's ignore the sort of last 3 years of releases. Let's ignore Blood Angels, White Scars, Dark Angels, the new Night Lord stuff. Everything else is going to be in a much different scale. Already something like the Palatine Blades, the Emperor's Children, or the World Eater's Rampages are smaller than the current plastics in Horus Heresy. Not a huge amount smaller, but a mil or two. And you're going to increase this scale by another 3 millimeters, roughly, with these new kits, if my measurements are sort of pretty close. Well, that means that our existing range of World Eaters are now going to be 5 millimeters shorter. So to give people some perspective, you're talking about models getting about 1/5 to 1/6 shorter in comparison to one another. That's incredibly noticeable. And the funny thing about people who paint models is, yes, some people are just playing for fun and they don't care, but a lot of people want some proportionality to exist in their forces. This means that they don't want to see two different height of Marine in their army. Some people do, and that's totally cool, but some people don't, which is also totally cool, and I fall into that latter category, where it's like, hey, I want all my Marines to look the same size. I don't want my, specialist, kick-ass, awesome units in my army to, be made up of all the midgets in the army, as it were. Just silly. So that's definitely something that has to be taken into account. And the biggest one people pointed out was one I harped on about, which was tanks. All of the tanks already feel too small for the miniatures. So rather than upscaling the tanks, they seem to mostly just be upscaling the infantry. Even with the plastic Spartan that we've seen, it doesn't look to be, percentage points bigger than the existing one. If not, it's just the exact same size. Well, if things aren't getting bigger in the vehicle world, the fact that you make all your infantry bigger is a major point. And as many people point out in the comments, they said, they managed to make the Chaos Space Marine range bigger, but again, think about the Chaos Space Marine range in 40k. The Thousand Suns range, the models that got upscaled was essentially a single squad of power armor and a couple of characters. In the Death Guard range, it's whatever power armor they got. So that's 2 ranges. We still haven't got Emperor's Children, you still haven't got Khorne Berserkers, you haven't got any of the other Chaos Legions, your Night Lords, your Word Bearers, your Iron Warriors, things like that. But you've got your stock Chaos Space Marine infantry and your new characters that are coming out. So they hadn't managed to upscale the whole range effectively, just some. And the vehicles haven't been worked on in who knows how long now. The Mark II Rhino, the current model of Rhino in 40k, I'm pretty sure is the 2001 release. Was notable at the time because it was $40, and the original Rhino was $35, and people were shocked. But then when they saw it was so much bigger than that first Rhino, which was made with that sort of rogue trader scale in mind, they were cool with it. $5, and they went, it's quite a lot bigger, I guess. Now that Rhino is starting to feel a bit small again. It was never quite perfect, but now it's starting to feel very inadequate, we'll say. But anyway, so that's what people took away from this. Yeah, they prefer larger models, but they also don't prefer them at the expense of making the existing ranges of models look inadequate. They don't want 2 different scales within one army, which does mean that going forward with any Heresy releases, it's going to be a bit annoying to a lot of people that there's an entirely new scale introduced to the game potentially. Now, I have to say potentially because, pictures generally don't lie, but they can be misinterpreted. So I could be totally wrong with my assumption that scale is getting taller, but everything I've seen leads me that way. So the next one that we spoke about was based off this tweet. The quickest way to kill a hobby is for the veterans to be total jerks to the newbies. If you want things to flourish, you have to invite and encourage new folks getting into it. I do agree with that sentiment. I think being dicks for the point of being dicks to people is absolutely stupid and makes you look like an idiot. So, fair point. But I don't think it's the biggest thing and the quickest way to kill a hobby. I have my own suspicions on what is, so I threw that poll out there. And that's where you get this one. So I'm only allowed to give 5 options in one of these polls. So we have availability due to price, location, stock levels, gatekeeping, either positive or negative types, a lack of community to play with, the difficulty of the kits. Now, I threw this one in for reasons I'll explain later, or confusion due to the rules and mechanics. So first things first, you kind of have to ignore the results on this one, because a lot of people in the comments say, to a degree, all of the above. Nobody, however, elaborated on the difficulty of kits. Now, the reason I threw that in there was because I wanted to know, does Forge World Resin really turn people off enough compared to these other things? And basically, no. To the point where people were actually commenting on the fact that it was sitting at 0%. People were not worried by the difficulty of the kits, because Games Workshop kits, compared to some of the higher end model kits full of etched brass railings and such, and turned aluminium barrels, and those fine detail military scale model kits are a lot more difficult than a lot of Games Workshop stuff. Also cheaper, work that out. But anyway, people didn't find the difficulty of kits to be the problem. The models coming from Games Workshop or Forge World is a non-issue compared to these other issues. It's not a non-issue overall. If you solve these other 4 things on this list, then it would be an issue. However, as it is, not a problem. People have bigger problems. So, gatekeeping, the original inciting thing. Positive or negative types. 4% of people. 4%. So, even when given, that as a direct option to pick from, people didn't really feel it was an issue. And when asked about it, some people simply said, well, I find that the local 40k group is mostly sort of the neckbeard, competitive types, and I don't enjoy playing in that environment. Well, that's not gatekeeping, that's just people who are just a bit toxic in general. It's not negative gatekeeping, it's just they are what they are. They're keeping their hobby pure for them, I suppose, if they don't let you play with them, but it sounds like they let people play with them, they're just unenjoyable to play with. That I can understand. So gatekeeping, yeah, some people said they'd had some negative experiences where they did feel gatekept. That sucks. But overall, very low on the list. And a lot of people did remark that, no, it wasn't really a problem to them, and they felt it was more beneficial in many cases that gatekeeping occurred, that it kept the hobby more wholesome. Make of that what you will. So, confusion due to rules and mechanics. Oh boy, that was a big one. And in fact, we'll double check this. Pretty sure we kind of come back to that in poll number 3. But so the gatekeeping, not an issue. Confusion due to rules and mechanics was a problem because people felt it was too hard to get into some games and some systems. And a lot of people remarked on the fact, as we'll get into in the next one, that they're sick of buying books. Absolutely gutful of buying books. They're over it. That I can agree with. The lack of community to play with was actually a far bigger deal than the 21% here suggests. In fact, many people say it's a very close runner-up to the availability. So, it's all good and well to have a wide variety of Horus Heresy miniatures, for example, available to you. If nobody within 100k of you plays it, it's not doing you very much beyond the ability to build and paint the models. Yeah, that would absolutely suck for people. I know how few games I feel like I get in of a gear playing Horus Heresy, and I live in a state where there's a lot of Horus Heresy players and a lot of people I'm friends with, and I get to fly interstate and all sorts of things to play the game. So it's a huge deal if you don't have a local community, and this doesn't just affect Horus Heresy. This is 30k, 40k, Age of Sigmar, even Warhammer Underworlds, like any game you can think of. This is a problem. I suppose that's where online video gaming really beats out this kind of old-fashioned gaming, and why things like Tabletop Simulator have become so popular. So definitely a big deal. Now, availability, the biggest one. And I broke it into 3 sort of subcategories, hoping people would elaborate on them, and they did a little bit. So the availability, either due to price, location, or stock levels. Naturally, the biggest one was price. People hate the prices, but you don't need a poll to tell you that. Games Workshop prices are terrible. They're terrible because you just have to compare them to what other companies put out. And people go, oh, well, other companies can be expensive too. Yeah, don't think other companies like, say, I don't know, Cromlech, or Anvil Industries, or Cyborg Miniatures. Think Tamiya. think Revell, model kits. They make a Panther tank that's bigger than a Land Raider, has 4 times the parts, and costs less than a Land Raider. That's what you have to compare to, because you're comparing a better like for like. You're talking other big companies who have the same sorts of technology as Games Workshop. They're not using boutique resin like a lot of the third-party competitors to Games Workshop are, who are trying to fit within this niche of what's legally allowed around the juggernaut that is Games Workshop's legal team. No, these other companies are like, hey, if you've got, plastic injection molders, this is literally how cheap you can sell a Panther tank for. They can sell, a Panther tank for $30. Meanwhile, it's $114 or something currently to buy a Land Raider. And the Land Raider quality is objectively worse than a Tamiya Panther tank. So if you want to spend the same money on that Panther tank as on that Land Raider, you get one hell of a good Panther tank for $130 or $114 or whatever. So price, big deal. Location. So a lot of people don't have a local Games Workshop. People in places like England, you can say, oh yeah, we've got however many Games Workshops. Let's say for, you only had 5. In all of the UK, you only had 5. That is still more stores in less space than there are in some Australian states. You go to Western Australia, okay, yep, sparsely populated in comparison to its landmass, I get it. A lot of desert and land in Western Australia you just wouldn't dream of living in, yet people do. But Western Australia is the size of half of Europe nearly, and it only has a couple of stores. So people who live in the more remote regions of Western Australia, hugely into the hobby, really want to play, they've got no chance of getting to those stores. That also ties into the lack of community to play with, because you live in a place like Karratha, it's going to be very hard to get to a Games Workshop when the closest Games Workshop is 2,400 kilometers away. So location, big deal. It's a very big deal. And stock levels. This one really pissed people off. Whether the people who DM'd me, because I've got a surprising amount of people who actually messaged me over this stuff, me personally, not just the outer circle or our emails, but me as James Macca, the guy running the channel, and spoke about it in length, about their very harsh feelings on it, which, hey, mirror my own. I'm a very harsh guy at times myself. And they felt that with the way scalping has been with Games Workshop, the difficulty in buying kits, things that they really wanted to purchase in the last couple of years, they just haven't been able to because they're all sold out within seconds of going up online. Whether it's books, whether it's models, whether it's rules. People really, really are over that. They feel like there needs to be a better understanding of what the community is going to buy from Games Workshop, which should be something that's very easy to gauge. You simply send out a poll, we're going to release this kit in 6 months' time, because again, there's no secrecy required. In fact, if Games Workshop said something like, we're going to re-release the Tyranids line, we're going to do an all-new Tyranids line in 12 months' time, anyone who's a competitor to Games Workshop who's thinking of releasing a Tyranids line is not even going to bother with the effort now, because they know that what Games Workshop does is probably going to be as good or better, and people are going to lap it up. So pre-projecting that out there to people, say, hey, our 12-month plan is Tyranids, people are going to go, holy shit, and they're going to start saving for it. And you put out a poll and you say, hey, how many people would be interested in buying this? And, not interested at all, slightly interested, very interested, definitely will buy, right? You can throw it out that way. And then you get a really good understanding of how many people want to buy those models. And then you can appropriately produce the correct amount of models. Instead, what Games Workshop's doing is they're doing these real limited runs of boxes, and then they're preying into either FOMO or to other factors, and they release these kits, and there's so few of them to go around that people just don't get them, and they all feel ripped off, and they get really annoyed with Games Workshop for this. And I get that. I've been very lucky that most of the stuff I've personally wanted, I've been able to get a hold of. But so many people I know said, I missed the Sisters of Battle release. I missed the initial Indominus release, And a lot of people saying that, hey, those second runs Games Workshop does are great, but Why can't they announce those things before these kits even get released and say, look, don't worry if you don't get one in the first wave, we'll get in the second step, because otherwise it encourages the scalping. So I guess you could say that availability almost ties into communication, and Games Workshop's absolutely terrible communication with the fan base. Which, to go slightly off topic here, their communication with the fan base now under Kevin Roundtree is better than it was under Kirby. Yes. But you're raising the bar from under the ground to sitting on the floor. Okay, Games Workshop's communication is still a one-way street. They do not talk with the community, they talk to the community. And I really have to reinforce this point in videos. The questions they answer, go on one of their live streams, for instance. Go on to their Twitch. If you ask them a question and they don't want to hear it, they'll mute it, moderate it, get rid of it, or ignore it. And we're not talking hard questions like, what is with your pricing of these models? No, we're talking simple questions like, when do you think there might be a release for this faction? You know, something that, you know, people looking for hope for their particular faction army thing they love. Anyway, moving on. Then there was this one, obviously talking about the new Horus Heresy system rumors. Now, again, wouldn't pay much into rumors normally, but this comes from the same people who released us that set of images with the plastic heresy, quote unquote. So I take it a little bit more seriously, and a lot of the things they raised are very believable. So if something's, you know, coming from the same leaking source and pretty plausible, then now I might talk about it, and I did in this case. So I asked these questions. So, if the Horus Heresy was to become a Games Workshop game, mainline, specialist, doesn't really matter, what is the priority people feel? Consistent content releases, clear, concise rules, not invalidated with day one FAQs, the availability of stock and a way to play in stores, the same stylistic tone, or a total range overhaul. So, funnily enough, the least viewed things on there was a total range overhaul with the infantry moving up in scale. How do you interpret that? Well, again, going back to the answers we got in poll 1, because all of these polls I put out tied in nicely with one another to help me build up a better understanding of the data I was collecting. Well, people are looking at the current Heresy range and going, you know what, it took them 9 years to get to the point where we got specialist units for the Dark Angels and we still haven't got the Primarch for the White Scars. After 9 fucking years. That's only 2 Primarchs a year we're asking for. 6 months sculpting for one model, you know? If that's how long it takes them at the moment to get miniatures out, even when there was a huge rush getting miniatures out in the first 3 years of the Horus Heresy, where they did a fantastic job, if we hand this over to Games Workshop and they change the scales, how long is it going to take to catch up and get all these specialist units in plastic? Or am I going to be stuck with a range with 2 different scales? People don't want that, so it's not a huge priority for them, and that played out in the comments. The next lowest one, equally low, was the availability of stock and a way to play in stores. And the availability of stock is an issue for people, as shown in the previous poll. And the way to play in stores was important to some people. So that's why I added it into this graph, or into this polling situation, because people decided that, hey, the current Games Workshop system sucks. If you do have a community in your area and you want to play Horus Heresy, you will pretty much not be doing it in a Games Workshop store because they're not interested in those sort of games. Most Games Workshop stores want you to play Age of Sigmar and 40k, maybe something like Warcry. They don't seem to be huge on Necromunda or Titanicus. They don't have a table set aside for it. Games Workshop has downsized their stores so much from when I was a kid that usually there's only one table that you can play on in them now, and the other table is there to demo and try and rope in kids into playing the game, which they won't be able to play in the store because there's no fucking tables to play on. Irony, right? So, huge problems right there. But in the end of the day, it didn't really care to most people, or matter, I should say, to most people, because they had bigger fish to fry. So moving up, consistent content releases. Now, these last 3 points, consistent style content releases, same stylistic tone, and clear, concise rules. These 3 are a lot closer than the chart appears that they are. People would vote and then say, hang on though, you know, no FAQs day one is very important to me, but tone and releases is about as important. and it was very hard. Like, I could make a graph. I break this chart down to 3 points. Clear, concise rules not invalidated with day one FAQs, with consistent releases and the same stylistic tone, and it would get nearly 100% of the graph if that was the case, if all three of those were rolled into one thing, because that's how much those three things combined meant to people. Again, it's all how you interpret the data. It's not that twice as many people thought FAQs day one was more important than the same stylistic tone. It's that twice as many people thought it was slightly more important than the same stylistic tone, so they put their vote that way. Hopefully that clears that up. So, the consistent content releases. The fact that Heresy is getting released every 3 to 6 months at the moment, and it plays out over the last 3 years that it's been a 3-monthly thing to get a single Heresy release. People don't like that. People want to, especially if you play a particular Legion, and then you find out that your Legion's models, all the other Legions have enough stuff to play, but you're not getting any models in the foreseeable year, and you have to wait 3 months only for the reveal to happen that you didn't get something. Instead, there's, some Lord of the Rings miniature or something gets released on a Friday. Yeah, that kills people's enthusiasm. They hate it, they despise it, and some people just say, no, not into this. And they give up. And that sucks. So people want the ability to basically play their Force in 30k fully fleshed out day one. Now, people might go, oh, that's a lot to ask for. Well, is it? You're talking about essentially Terminators and a squad of power-armed infantry for each Legion and a couple of characters. That's really all you're asking for each Legion. It's not that much in the scheme of things. Multiple Legions combined of new kits is only about the same as the average 40k release. So, not a big deal to release, a Terminator squad, a Power Armor squad, and a character. 3 kits. Like, it's not a lot to ask for, because most of the releases in Heresy, since Power Armor is so universal in the game, well, it looks after itself, because so many Legions can use the same stuff. It's only their specialist stuff that you've really got to look after. So on top of that, something like the Mechanicum, for instance, really could use plastic kits. The Mechanicum players, though, are going to be stuck with Forge World, and this Horus Heresy game becomes a Power Armor game more than it is now. Because right now, the Power Armor, it's probably only about half of what I see at events. The rest of the event is a good mix of but Militia, Solar Auxilia, Custodes, Sisters of Silence, Mechanicum. All very popular. Mechanicum is probably about a third of the people who aren't playing Marines, if not more. Mechanicum is hugely popular. So if they have to wait around and not get their plastics with this release, well, that's going to suck, because people who have no interest in playing Power Armor but all the interest in playing Mechanicum armies are not going to like that. So they need a consistent content release themselves, which is adding an immense amount of work onto what Games Workshop potentially is already giving themselves. So moving that point on, the same stylistic tone. People think it's important enough that over all these other things, they still voted for it in significant numbers. Out of 2,500 people, 22% of them said the same tone, the same grimdark, dulled down, sort of military scale modeler style of paint jobs, not this heavy metal shit that Games Workshop makes. And that's not to say it's bad. It's okay if you like it. Just ease up, get off the keyboard, put it the fuck down. No. It's to say that people like that tone, that style, over heavy metal for the Horus Heresy. It just seems to suit the game system better. And if you want to paint the heavy metal style with strong, high contrast edge highlights everywhere, you do you go for gold. I'm not going to deny you a game ever. No, it doesn't faze me. But people want to see the same effort and love put into the models and the books as well for this game. They want to see that same effort. That when the best thing about a Horus Heresy Black Book is not the rules. I think this is where people get confused. The rules are important, yes, but they're not the reason we buy the Black Books. We buy the Black Books from Forge World that cost $200 because these books have gorgeous artwork and backstory. If you change this to 40k chibi, cartoony, crappy CalArts artwork styles or something, and you have the same people who wrote The Gathering Storm write these books, no matter how good the plastic models are, this system will bomb because people don't like it. I don't like it. I wouldn't want to buy a book talking about the Horus Heresy and go from these almost photorealistic World Eater images from book 1 that roped me in to whatever the hell you would call the art in the current Space Marine Codex, which I'm not a fan of at all, the current style of art they do. It's lost all that. Yeah, give me Adrian Smith back. Come on, give me Adrian Smith. Even the Blanche stuff, the old John Blanche stuff. For as much as I hate sepia and red, he embodied the feel of 40k so much better than a lot of modern stuff does. A lot of modern stuff just feels wrong. I don't know what it is. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I don't like it. And again, 22% of 2,500 people felt that meant more to them than all these other problems or potential problems. And lastly, of course, the clear, concise rules not invalidated with FAQs on day one. 43% of the vote. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that people hate where the rules are currently. And again, majority of the comments revolved around that. It was not only the most popular point, it was the most popular point with people writing comments. And again, several people felt the need to PM me. And I'm fine with that, by the way. I don't mind getting messages. They messaged me and said, like, hey, I play 40k and I've had to buy 8 books on my Space Marines in 4 years. I'm fucking over it. I just want to play Space Marines. I don't want my rules to be invalidated every 4 weeks. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Another one was, stuff I've said before, which other people echoed, which is I shouldn't have to be hauling around 9 black books and a couple of other Legion red books with myself in order to play all the units that are available to a Marine army in the Horus Heresy. That's too much. You need to condense it all down into a single volume of rules. And then from there, you have a book for rules and a book for fluff. And your fluff book's full of beautiful art and interesting background stories, and you don't touch that book. Okay? This is my idea based on what I've read from people, their feedback. You make a beautiful fluff book that people don't have to update, and then you make a really, really cheap rules book. One rule book for the game, and rule book for each major overfaction. So Marines as a whole, that kind of thing. And that book doesn't need to be fucked with. And if it is fucked with, it's cheap and easy to replace, like $30, not $130 or $200. Then you give each sub-faction their own rules. Now, whether you do it in a campaign or you do it in all the main factions in a single book and then you give them an overhaul every year or two, people would prefer that. But by breaking it down into different sections, it makes it easier. Because if you put all the Legion rules into one book, and then you put all the Legion units into one book, like, your Rhino tank, your Predator tanker alongside, your Raven Guard rules, if you modify one of those things, then you've got to replace the whole book. And if the book is really big, it becomes a really expensive replacement. Whereas if you have your Rhino and your Predator in one book, and you have your Raven Guard Marines in a different book, well, if the Raven Guard get changed, that's just a cheap little $10 Raven Guard book. Change it. It doesn't invalidate the whole rest of the range. So that's very important to people. So that would be my solution to get around that problem. Of course, they could always try giving out the rules for free, but we know Games Workshop and free stuff is, I don't know, it's like showing a cross to a vampire. They hiss and fly off into the night. So yeah, that's what we learned here today. People, the day one FAQs, proofread your shit. Games Workshop, for all people say about them, they're so good now, they talk to the community, and they seem to still be unable to proofread their stuff because the amount of typos and unclear rules you get on day one in books, and the amount of books that have had an FAQ on the day they're released. Huge problems. If someone like myself can come along, pick up a book, and within my first read, pick up a whole bunch of problems, you have to ask, how come they couldn't in the so-called year of development, or 2 years of development they spent on every release? One could say they're probably, being a little bit fake with their answers there. And last thing for the day, a little bonus. So, Games Workshop Quality Control added again. Several people received a different miniature when they bought Malagos the Twisted. They bought the miniature, and here's one example of it. There are multiples out there. I've put 2 up, I think, so far, of, I think, 3 that I've been sent. Different people. But yeah, they got a different Sons of Horus character in the Malagos the Twisted box, or blister pack. And so you have to ask the question, what went wrong here? Look, when it comes to working in a production environment, I myself come from the plastic industry. I was an engineer in the plastics industry. Now I'm running a whole plastics factory. I got promoted in the last month. Yay, good for me. Not important. What is important is people's attitudes. A lot of people work a 9-to-5 job. They're not thrilled about it. They do the job because they need to pay their bills, support themselves, support their family. It's just the harsh reality of life. Not everyone gets to do what they love. And especially if they're under terrible bosses or tight deadlines, they'll care even less. My guess here is that some person who's just trying to pay the bills and works at Nottingham packaged this up, and they just put the wrong thing in the box because they didn't know better. They're like, oh yeah, it's in the box over there labeled Sons of Horus stuff. And they didn't read the fine print, the product code or whatever, because it's probably not labeled Malagos the Twisted War Masters Ecurie on the box of spares. It's probably labeled, product code TB4007643, something like that. And they just grabbed a whole bunch of bits out of that and threw it all in a thing and said, yep, good to go. They didn't think twice about it. They thought they were doing the right thing. They grabbed the character from the Sons of Horus box. They didn't realize they grabbed the wrong character, and this is clearly not Malagos the Twisted. So some people will say, their quality control must be terrible. Yeah, it is what it is. There's no second set of eyes here checking everything. But let's not get too harsh in blaming them. It's probably just some poor person trying to do a job. I'm not going to critique that. That's well beneath me. Punch up, not down. The model in question, I can't think of who it could actually be. There's one named Sons of Horus character, apart from Abaddon, who even uses a power fist. All the other ones, like the Either, the Or, Loken, Torgadon, Axeman, none of them use a power fist. My guess, therefore, is this is just a generic Sons of Horus Power Armored Praetor to replace the current Power Armored Praetor, the one that's so much shorter and smaller than Malagos the Twisted. Now, again, plays into the point I raised in a previous video. I don't care for new Sons of Horus releases. Sounds harsh, but Sons of Horus have everything. When you've got legions like the Raven Guard, no characters or special characters. Iron Warriors, no characters or special characters. Iron Hands, single Iron Father miniature, no other characters or special characters. Salamanders, no characters or special characters. Ultramarines, no characters or special characters except for a single banner bearer that you can only purchase at Forge World stores. You see the problem here. Meanwhile, you've got Sons of Horus here, who have they have a Legion Consul, a Legion banner bearer. They have Loken, they have Abaddon, they have their Primarch, and they've got Malagos the Twisted. That's 6 right there. This guy makes 7, although I imagine that other banner bearer and existing consul that come together will probably get discontinued if there's a new consul on the scene, which is a real shame because that's a really nice banner. And actually, funny story, that Sons of Horus banner bearer is actually owned by a really close friend of mine who was given it by Matthew Kane himself. The actual original one you see on the Forge World web store. I know where that is. So there you go. And it's in Australia, not the UK. But yeah, so Sons of Horus, they've got more characters than you poke a stick at. They've got 6, 7 if you include the Primarch, straight off the top of my head. Meanwhile, you've got 5 whole factions who've just got no characters. So that disparity right there is a huge problem. This whole potential focus on the Siege of Terra being the next big thing, it also leaves a really, it leaves that blank scene missing icon in your mind because you've gone from the Horus Heresy breaks out and all the books so far are basically the individual war zones where traitors and loyalists first hit one another. The only book that sort of delves a little bit into some of the darker stuff that's happening is Book 6, which talks about Black Shields and, some of the special characters and stuff. But you're essentially going from start of the Heresy, the Chaos Space Marines are still basically Great Crusade Space Marines. And then that's what all the books to Book 9 are. It's Great Crusade Space Marines fighting other Great Crusade Space Marines. By the end of this conflict, the Siege of Terra, it is not that. It is Proto-Chaos Space Marines versus Imperial Space Marines. They're two completely different beasts by that point. They've introduced new units, new tactics, new armors to some of these forces and not to others. And yet, this initial box set that looks like it's coming out and the way the releases are going that seem to be pushing this Solar War thing is going to be having Sons of Horus Marines who look like Great Crusade Space Marines fighting Imperial Fists that look like Great Crusade Space Marines, and they're all going to be wearing the newest form of armor that makes no sense in the background lore. And what people have to remember is it's not true for everyone, but it's true for most of us. We treat this more like a historical game, playing out the events of the past, as opposed to playing out a strictly fantasy game like maybe 40k is. The lore is kind of sacred to people. And it worries me a bit, and it worries a lot of people. Doesn't mean that you have to be worried about it, but it's something I think worth keeping in the back of your head. Anyway, back with the Outer Circle. Hope you enjoyed this episode. The next one that comes out might be the one on 3D printing resin. I'm trying to do a start-to-stop video on 3D printing resin. Some real basic beginner stuff. And then sometime in the next week or two, I've been talking to the guys over at Dark Foundry Miniatures who are going to provide me some STLs from their fantastic lineup. You can get them on Patreon. And they're going to provide me some sample miniatures, and I'm going to print those to show you the sort of infantry you can produce at home. Some really diverse kits too, that you can produce at home on a 3D printer. Make the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching. Leave your comments, thoughts, feedback below. Tell me what I got dramatically wrong too. Don't be afraid to. Just be constructive in your tone. And I'll see you all next time.